The fastest way to reveal a person's character is to watch how they treat someone they believe has nothing to offer. The rain tapped softly against the tall windows of Whitmore Capital's private dining lounge, turning the Manhattan skyline into a watercolor of silver lights and blurred shadows. Inside, crystal glasses caught the glow of expensive chandeliers. Conversations floated through the room like background music. Deals were being made. Futures were being negotiated. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Whitmore. At 38, Ethan had become the kind of man business magazines like to place on their covers. Self-made billionaire. Visionary CEO. One of the most influential names in American technology. People listened when he spoke. Investors followed his decisions. Employees feared disappointing him. Tonight was no different. Seated with several board members and potential partners, Ethan reviewed a stack of documents while barely touching the 12-ounce ribeye resting on his plate. His silver Swiss watch reflected the light each time he turned a page. Around him, executives laughed at jokes that weren't particularly funny. Nobody wanted to risk being the only one not laughing. Across the room, Claire Bennett moved quietly between tables carrying a tray of coffee cups. Most guests never noticed her. That was normal. Waitresses were often part of the furniture in places like this. Seen, but not truly observed. Claire preferred it that way. Her dark blonde hair was neatly tied back. Her black uniform was spotless despite a long shift. A small notebook peeked from the pocket of her apron. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything remarkable, and yet there was something unusual about the way she carried herself. Calm, steady, unhurried, as if the noise around her existed in a different world. Ethan noticed her only when she accidentally stepped into a conversation. One of his younger associates had waved for another coffee refill while trying to impress a visiting investor. Claire approached with practiced professionalism and filled the cup without interrupting. The associate glanced at her name tag. Then he smirked. "Long night, Claire." She offered a polite smile. "A little busy tonight, sir. At least you don't have to worry about quarterly earnings reports." The table chuckled. Claire simply nodded. "I suppose not." The associate leaned back in his chair. "Lucky you. Some jobs don't require much education." More laughter followed. Not loud, not cruel, just enough to make the point. Claire remained perfectly still. "Maybe." She set down the coffee pot. "Anything else I can get for you?" "A finance degree might help," another executive joked. This time several people laughed harder. Ethan didn't join them, but he didn't stop them either. He barely looked up from his paperwork. In his mind, the conversation wasn't important. People occupied different places in life. That was simply reality. Claire thanked them, turned, and walked away. No anger, no embarrassment, no reaction at all. For some reason, that bothered Ethan more than if she had argued. He glanced up briefly as she disappeared toward the kitchen. The investor sitting beside him shook his head. "You have to admire people like that. Simple life. Less stress." Ethan signed a document. "Maybe." The rain continued falling outside. Claire returned to another table carrying a tray of coffee. Her expression never changed. Her pace never slowed. And across the room, without understanding why, Ethan found himself watching her for just a second longer than necessary before returning his attention to the business in front of him. Neither of them knew it yet. But before the night was over, one sentence would change everything. Claire Bennett had learned years ago that silence often revealed more than words ever could. She pushed through the kitchen doors carrying an empty tray and stepped into the warm glow of the service area. Around her, dishes clinked. Orders were called out. Steam drifted from the line cooks preparing late dinners for people who would never remember the names of those serving them. It was just after 8 o'clock. The busiest part of the evening was beginning. Most of the staff moved quickly, chasing the rhythm of the night. Claire moved differently. Calm, precise, never rushed, never flustered. One of the younger waiters leaned beside the espresso machine and shook his head. "Those guys at table 12 are something else." Claire smiled faintly. "Important meeting?" "Apparently. $1 billion contracts. Private jets. The whole thing." He lowered his voice. "I would not survive one day in that world." Claire stacked a few saucers. "You might surprise yourself." The waiter laughed. "Trust me, I barely survived high school algebra." Claire's smile widened for a moment before she returned to work. A few minutes later, she slipped into a quiet storage hallway behind the kitchen. Most employees used it for quick breaks. At the far end stood a small wooden bench beside a narrow window overlooking the rain-soaked street below. Claire sat down for exactly 60 seconds. No more. No less. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out the small notebook that rarely left her side. The leather cover had faded with age. The pages were filled with handwritten notes, favorite passages, and thoughts collected over many years. She opened it to a random page. Her eyes scanned several lines. The noise of the restaurant seemed to disappear. For a brief moment, she was somewhere else entirely. Not inside a luxury dining room. Not carrying trays. Not balancing customer requests. Just a woman alone with words she loved. The kitchen door opened suddenly. Claire. It was her manager, Rebecca. Claire immediately closed the notebook and stood. Sorry. Break is over. Rebecca glanced at the notebook but said nothing. Actually, I need you back on the floor. The boardroom group just requested dessert service. Claire nodded. Of course. As she walked back through the hallway, the notebook disappeared into her apron once more. Hidden, like so many other things. Out in the dining room, Ethan Whitmore was no longer reviewing contracts. The investor presentation had ended. The conversation had shifted toward politics, education, and culture. Topics successful people often discussed when they wanted to sound thoughtful after business was finished. Ethan listened with half his attention. One executive spoke confidently about declining academic standards. Another complained that people no longer appreciated great literature. A third claimed that most Americans had never read a serious book after college. The group agreed enthusiastically. Ethan swirled the remaining ice in his glass and stared toward the city lights beyond the window. Then movement caught his attention. Claire crossed the room carrying a silver tray. She moved between tables with effortless focus. For some reason, he remembered the comments directed at her earlier. The jokes, the assumptions, her complete lack of reaction. Most people would have defended themselves. Most people would have looked embarrassed. She had done neither. Ethan found that strangely unsettling. A person with nothing to prove should not appear so confident. As Claire delivered a fresh pot of coffee to a nearby table, she briefly adjusted the edge of her apron. For a fraction of a second, a small worn notebook became visible before slipping out of sight again. Ethan noticed it. Then he looked away. He did not know why such a small detail stayed in his mind. But somewhere deep inside, curiosity had already begun replacing certainty. And for a man who built his life on certainty, that was a very unusual feeling. The evening settled into a comfortable rhythm. Rain continued to trace soft paths down the tall windows while conversations drifted from table to table like distant music. Claire Bennett moved through the dining room carrying a fresh tray of coffee cups. She remembered names, preferred desserts, allergies, small details most people overlooked. It was one of the reasons customers often requested her section. Not because she was loud or charming, because she paid attention. Across the room, Ethan Whitmore watched another executive launch into a familiar speech about success. The problem these days, the man said, cutting into a slice of cheesecake, is that too many people expect rewards without earning expertise. Several people nodded. Ethan nodded too. On the surface, he agreed. His entire career had been built on discipline, sacrifice, and relentless work. Yet his attention drifted away from the conversation and toward the woman refilling water glasses near the far wall. Claire seemed completely unaffected by the status games that quietly governed the room. Investors wanted admiration. Executives wanted recognition. Entrepreneurs wanted validation. Claire appeared to want none of it. That puzzled him. Most people wanted something. Respect. Approval. Opportunity. Money. Everyone reached for something. But every time Ethan looked at Claire, she seemed perfectly content focusing on the task directly in front of her. The thought lingered longer than it should have. A few minutes later, another guest arrived. Professor Daniel Mercer, a nationally known literary scholar from Columbia University. Several people immediately recognized him and invited him to join the gathering. Within minutes, the conversation shifted away from business and toward books, history, and culture. Professor Mercer had the effortless confidence of someone accustomed to speaking before large audiences. Stories flowed easily from him. Quotations appeared naturally in conversation. People listened. Ethan found the discussion more interesting than the endless financial projections from earlier. For the first time all evening, he relaxed. Claire happened to be nearby when the professor began discussing Shakespeare. She was collecting empty dessert plates from a neighboring table. Nobody paid attention to her presence. Why would they? She was simply doing her job. Shakespeare understood ambition better than any writer in history, Professor Mercer declared. One line captures the entire human condition. Several guests leaned forward with interest. The professor smiled and confidently recited a famous quotation. A few people immediately praised the observation. Others repeated portions of the line. Ethan listened quietly. Something unexpected happened. Claire paused for less than a second while lifting a plate. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But Ethan noticed. It was the same brief hesitation someone might have after hearing a familiar song played slightly off-key. Then she continued working. Nothing about her expression changed. Nothing about her posture shifted. Yet for reasons he could not explain, Ethan suddenly remembered the notebook hidden inside her apron. The room continued discussing literature. Opinions bounced back and forth across the table. Outside, thunder rumbled somewhere beyond the city skyline. Inside, crystal glasses reflected warm golden light. Claire carried her tray toward the kitchen doors. Just before she disappeared, she glanced back toward the group for the briefest moment. Her expression was thoughtful, not impressed, not intimidated, simply thoughtful. And for the second time that evening, Ethan found himself wondering whether he had completely misjudged the quiet woman everyone else seemed determined not to see. Professor Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention. Around the table, executives and investors listened with the same focus they usually reserved for quarterly reports and acquisition strategies. Literature had become the evening's newest currency. Knowledge was being displayed. Opinions were being exchanged. Status was quietly being measured. The beauty of Shakespeare, Professor Mercer said, lifting his coffee cup, is that every generation finds itself inside the same stories. Several guests nodded in agreement. Ethan Whitmore watched the conversation unfold while absent-mindedly turning his glass in slow circles across the tablecloth. He noticed Claire Bennett emerge from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh coffee. Once again, she moved through the room without drawing attention to herself. The professor continued speaking. Ambition, pride, loyalty, regret. Human nature never changes. A senior investor smiled. That is why great books survive. Exactly, Mercer replied. Most people quote Shakespeare without actually understanding him. Light laughter followed. Claire reached the edge of their table and quietly began refilling cups. The professor appeared pleased with his audience. Ethan noticed something else. Claire was listening. Not openly, not dramatically, but she heard every word. Years of serving tables had probably taught her how to listen without being noticed. My favorite example, Mercer continued, comes from Julius Caesar. He paused for effect. A perfect reminder that destiny controls more of our lives than we like to admit. Several guests leaned forward. The professor confidently recited a famous line. The words sounded elegant, familiar. The table immediately responded with approval. Beautiful. One of Shakespeare's best. Remarkably relevant. Claire carefully set down a coffee pot. Her hand stopped for less than a heartbeat. Then continued. Ethan saw it again. That tiny hesitation. That same reaction from earlier. A reaction nobody else seemed to notice. The professor smiled. Of course, that quote captures the idea that our futures are written long before we arrive. More nods followed. Claire lowered her eyes toward the empty cups she was collecting. Her expression remained calm. Yet Ethan had the distinct feeling that something was wrong. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just wrong. The kind of feeling an experienced businessman developed after years of spotting flaws hidden inside polished presentations. One executive noticed Claire standing nearby. What do you think? He asked casually. Several people laughed. Yes, Claire, another added with a grin. Do you read much Shakespeare during your lunch breaks? More laughter drifted around the table. It was not cruel. Not exactly. But it carried the familiar assumption that everyone in the room understood. Claire was the waitress. The others were the experts. Claire offered a polite smile. Not during lunch. A few guests chuckled. The conversation should have ended there. It usually did. But this time something unexpected happened. Professor Mercer looked toward her with mild curiosity. Have you read Julius Caesar? He asked. The question sounded harmless. Almost playful. Claire adjusted the tray in her hands. Yes, sir. Then perhaps you agree with my interpretation. Silence settled briefly over the table. Ethan looked up. For the first time all evening, his attention was completely focused. Claire glanced toward the rain beyond the windows, then back at the professor. Her voice remained soft, respectful, calm. Actually, she said, I am not sure Shakespeare intended that meaning at all. The room became very still. For a moment, nobody spoke. The soft clink of silverware from distant tables suddenly seemed louder than the conversation itself. Professor Mercer blinked once, then smiled politely. That is an interesting observation. Claire held the tray comfortably against her side. I could be wrong. Her tone remained gentle, unthreatening. But I do not think the passage argues that destiny controls our lives. One of the executives exchanged an amused look with a colleague. Ethan noticed it immediately. The assumption was still there. The quiet certainty that whatever came next could not possibly challenge the professor. Mercer folded his hands. And what do you believe Shakespeare intended? Claire glanced toward the rain-streaked windows. Responsibility. The professor raised an eyebrow. Several guests leaned forward. Claire continued. The line is often treated as a statement about fate. But Cassius is arguing the opposite. He is telling Brutus that people blame destiny for situations they have helped create themselves. The room grew quieter. In other words, Claire said softly, the tragedy comes from refusing to accept responsibility. Ethan sat completely still. Something about her answer felt different from casual knowledge. It was not memorized. It was understood. Professor Mercer nodded slowly. A fair interpretation. Claire offered a small smile. Thank you. The conversation could have ended there. Most people would have stopped. Most people would have recognized the social imbalance and retreated. Claire simply waited. Calm. Patient. Then Mercer asked another question. And what makes you so confident in that reading? It was not hostile. It sounded genuinely curious. Claire lowered her eyes for a second. The context. The context. People often quote individual lines, she said. But Shakespeare usually reveals meaning through the scenes around them. That is why isolated quotations can be misleading. Ethan felt something shift in the room. The amusement had disappeared. People were listening now. Really listening. Claire continued. Cassius is not encouraging surrender to fate. He is challenging Brutus to stop blaming circumstances. The entire conversation is about choice. One executive set down his fork. Another quietly leaned closer. Professor Mercer stared at her for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not the polite smile of a public speaker. A genuine smile. That, he said, is exactly how I taught the passage during my first years at Columbia. Several guests looked surprised. Mercer laughed softly. Most people miss that detail. Claire seemed almost embarrassed by the attention. It is a remarkable play. Ethan glanced toward the small notebook hidden inside her apron pocket. Suddenly he understood why she carried it. Not because she wanted to appear intellectual. Not because she wanted attention. Because these books genuinely mattered to her. The professor studied her carefully. You must have spent a great deal of time reading Shakespeare. Claire hesitated. A little. A few people smiled at the understatement. Mercer chuckled. That answer alone tells me the amount is probably much more than a little. Light laughter rippled across the table. But this time the laughter felt different. Respectful. Warm. Not directed at her. Shared with her. Ethan watched Claire as she gathered the empty cups. Her expression had not changed. No triumph. No satisfaction. No need to prove anything. She simply picked up the coffee pot and prepared to return to work. Yet somehow, in less than 5 minutes, the quiet waitress everyone had overlooked had become the most interesting person in the room. Claire turned to leave, believing the conversation had reached its natural end. It had not. Wait, Professor Mercer said. His voice carried no challenge now, only curiosity. Claire paused. The tray rested lightly against her hip. Around the table, nobody seemed interested in dessert anymore. The room had quietly reorganized itself around a different kind of attention. One more question, Mercer said. What is your favorite Shakespeare play? Claire looked almost uncomfortable, as if being asked about herself was far more difficult than discussing literature. That changes depending on the year, she answered. A few people smiled. Mercer laughed softly. A fair answer. He thought for a moment. And this year? Claire glanced toward the rain outside. Tiny rivers of water slid down the glass, distorting the lights of Manhattan into streaks of gold and silver. King Lear. Several guests exchanged surprised looks. Most expected Romeo and Juliet. Perhaps Hamlet. Not King Lear. Mercer tilted his head. Interesting choice. Claire nodded. People think it is about power or family, but I think it is mostly about seeing clearly. Ethan found himself listening more closely than ever. Claire continued. The tragedy begins because people mistake appearances for truth. They trust what sounds impressive instead of what is genuine. The words landed quietly, yet somehow they seemed to settle over the entire table. Nobody interrupted. Lear spends most of the story misunderstanding the people around him, Claire said. Then when he finally sees clearly, it is almost too late. The professor stared at her for several seconds. That is remarkably perceptive. Claire lowered her eyes. It is only my interpretation. No, Mercer replied. It is more than that. Silence followed. Not an awkward silence. A thoughtful one. Ethan noticed something unusual happening inside himself. For years, he had developed a habit of categorizing people quickly. Investors, competitors, employees, experts, assistants, valuable, irrelevant, useful, unimportant. It made decisions easier, faster, efficient. But Claire refused to fit inside any category he understood. She was standing there in a server's uniform holding an empty coffee pot, yet speaking with more insight than many executives he paid six-figure salaries to advise him. One of the investors finally spoke. Where did you study? The question arrived naturally, almost inevitably. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the tray. It was the first visible sign of discomfort Ethan had seen all evening. A few different places, she answered. The investor smiled. Literature degree? Claire hesitated. Just briefly. Something like that. The answer only deepened the mystery. Mercer looked as though he wanted to ask more. Instead, he simply nodded. Well, wherever you studied, they were fortunate to have you. For the first time all evening, genuine color touched Claire's cheeks. Not pride. Not vanity. Embarrassment. She thanked him quietly and turned toward the kitchen. This time nobody stopped her. As she disappeared through the doors, conversation slowly resumed. Yet the energy had changed. The executives were no longer discussing her as a waitress. They were discussing her as a person. Ethan remained silent. His untouched coffee sat cooling beside him. Across the room, the kitchen doors swung closed behind Claire. And for reasons he could not fully explain, Ethan Whitmore suddenly wanted to know everything about the woman who seemed determined to reveal almost nothing. The dinner crowd slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but Ethan Whitmore found that normal was no longer available to him. Conversations continued around the table. Deals were discussed. Market forecasts were debated. Yet his attention kept drifting toward the kitchen doors where Claire Bennett had disappeared. It made no sense. He had spent his entire career surrounded by exceptional people. Nobel Prize winners, distinguished economists, influential politicians, founders of billion-dollar companies. Yet somehow a waitress carrying a coffee tray had become the most intriguing person he had encountered in months. Across the room, Claire emerged from the kitchen with a fresh stack of dessert menus. She resumed working as though nothing unusual had happened. No sign of accomplishment. No desire to revisit the discussion. No attempt to capitalize on the attention she had earned. Ethan watched her stop beside an elderly couple seated near the window. She listened carefully, smiled warmly, adjusted a dessert recommendation after learning about a dietary restriction. Small things. Ordinary things. Yet she gave them her complete attention. The same attention she had given Shakespeare. The same attention she seemed to give everyone. Most people changed depending on who stood in front of them. Claire did not. Ethan found that increasingly rare. Nearly 30 minutes passed before their paths crossed again. Claire approached his table carrying a fresh coffee pot. Would anyone care for a refill? Several guests accepted. Ethan held out his cup. Claire poured quietly. Thank you, he said. The words surprised even him. Claire looked up briefly. You are welcome, sir. Ethan studied her expression. Calm as always. That was an impressive conversation earlier. Claire returned the coffee pot to an upright position. Professor Mercer was very kind. You know that is not what I meant. For a second, something almost resembling amusement appeared in her eyes. People are often kinder than they receive credit for. Ethan glanced toward the professor's table. You never answered his question. Which one? Where you studied? Claire adjusted the tray slightly. That was not really part of the conversation. Perhaps not. Ethan paused. But it seems like a reasonable question. Claire smiled politely. Many questions are reasonable. Then she moved on to the next guest before he could continue. Ethan stared after her. One of his colleagues laughed. You just got professionally redirected. A few people chuckled. Ethan surprised himself by smiling. Apparently. Yet the brief exchange only deepened his curiosity. Most people eagerly shared their accomplishments. Degrees hung on office walls. Awards appeared in biographies. Success was advertised. Claire seemed determined to keep hers hidden. Later that evening, as the crowd began to thin, Ethan stepped away from the table and walked toward the large windows overlooking the city. Rain still covered the glass. Far below, headlights drifted through the streets like rivers of light. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of pages turning. He glanced toward a nearby corner of the dining room. Claire stood alone for a moment beside an empty table. Her notebook rested open in her hands. She was reading while waiting for the next request. Not scrolling through a phone. Not checking messages. Reading. The sight lasted only a few seconds before another customer called her name. She closed the notebook immediately and returned to work. Yet Ethan had seen enough. The mystery was no longer whether Claire Bennett possessed knowledge. That answer was obvious. The mystery was why someone with that knowledge was standing in a restaurant carrying coffee instead of standing in front of a classroom, publishing books, or leading discussions of her own. And for the first time in many years, Ethan Whitmore realized there was a question he genuinely wanted answered. The restaurant finally began to empty. The energy that had filled the dining room for hours softened into something quieter. Chairs were returned to their places, and used candles flickered near the windows. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle mist that wrapped Manhattan in silver light. Claire Bennett moved through the final stages of her shift with the same steady focus she had shown all evening. To anyone watching, nothing about her seemed different. Yet the conversations from earlier still lingered in the air like an echo. Professor Mercer had left nearly 40 minutes ago. Several executives had departed soon after. Ethan Whitmore remained. Officially, he was finishing paperwork. In reality, he was observing. Not in a suspicious way. In a curious one. Claire carried a stack of dessert plates toward the kitchen. When she returned, she stopped briefly at an empty table near the back of the room. A folded newspaper rested there. Without thinking, she glanced at a headline discussing education funding cuts across several states. Her expression changed slightly. Not anger. Not frustration. Concern. Then she continued working. Ethan noticed. Small details revealed more than grand speeches. That was something business had taught him years ago. A person's priorities often appeared in moments they believed nobody was watching. A few minutes later, Rebecca approached Claire with a clipboard. You can head home after table 7 leaves, she said. You carried half the dining room tonight. Claire smiled. Thank you. And whatever happened over there with Professor Mercer, Rebecca added quietly. I think half the staff is talking about it. Claire laughed softly. That is unfortunate. Most people would be proud. Most people are probably wiser than I am. Rebecca shook her head and walked away smiling. Ethan found himself smiling as well. The response sounded genuine. Not rehearsed. Not falsely modest. Genuine. Soon afterward, the last guests settled their checks and left. The dining room grew still. Claire began wiping down a nearby table. For the first time all evening, there was no rush. No orders waiting. No customers calling her name. Just silence. Ethan finally stood from his chair and crossed the room. His expensive shoes barely made a sound against the polished floor. Claire looked up as he approached. Good evening, Mr. Whitmore. Ethan is fine. Old habits are difficult to break. That sounds like something a literature student would say. Claire paused, then smiled. Perhaps. Ethan leaned lightly against the back of a chair. So you were a literature student. I did not say that. You did not deny it either. Claire folded the cleaning cloth in her hands. The small notebook remained tucked inside her apron pocket. Ethan noticed it again. You are remarkably careful with information, he said. Information is valuable. You sound like a CEO. That answer surprised him. Claire immediately looked away, almost as if she regretted saying it. Ethan laughed quietly. Fair point. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Then Ethan asked the question that had been growing in his mind all evening. Why are you here? Claire looked confused. In Manhattan? In this restaurant? Her gaze drifted toward the windows, toward the city lights beyond the glass. When she finally answered, her voice was calm. Because life rarely follows the outline we write for it. Ethan stared at her. It was not the answer he expected. It was better. And somewhere deep inside, a realization began to form. Whatever story Claire Bennett carried behind those careful answers and that worn notebook, it was far larger than anyone in this building had imagined. Claire gathered her belongings a few minutes later and slipped quietly into the Manhattan night. The notebook disappeared into her canvas bag. The restaurant lights faded behind her. Within moments, she was simply another face moving through the city. Ethan Whitmore stood near the window and watched until she vanished into the crowd. That should have been the end of it. It was not. The next morning, Ethan arrived at his office on the 43rd floor before sunrise. The city below was still waking up. Coffee steamed beside his laptop. Financial reports waited for review. Acquisition proposals filled his inbox. Yet his attention kept returning to a waitress who quoted Shakespeare with more insight than a nationally recognized professor expected. By 8 o'clock, his chief of staff, Lauren Mitchell, entered carrying a stack of briefing folders. "Busy day," she said. 3 investor meetings, 2 media interviews, and the Education Initiative board call at 4. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly. "Lauren." "Yes. Have you ever met someone who makes absolutely no sense?" She blinked. "That is an unusual way to start a Thursday." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "A person whose situation and abilities do not match." Lauren considered the question. "More often than you would think." Ethan stared through the glass walls of his office. "Interesting." The conversation ended there, but the thought remained. Later that afternoon, curiosity finally overcame discipline. Ethan opened his laptop and typed a name into a search engine. Claire Bennett. Thousands of results appeared. Most belonged to other people. Teachers, lawyers, athletes, journalists. None looked familiar. He refined the search. Manhattan. Literature. Academic publications. For several minutes, nothing useful appeared. Then he found a reference buried inside an archived university newsletter from nearly 7 years earlier. Ethan sat forward. The article highlighted a national undergraduate research competition. One participant had received special recognition for an essay analyzing Shakespearean tragedy through the lens of moral responsibility. The student's name was Claire Bennett. Ethan stared at the screen. The accompanying photograph was younger, but unmistakable. The same calm eyes. The same reserved smile. He continued reading. Academic distinction. Exceptional performance. Faculty recommendations. Scholarship recipient. Ethan opened another result. Then another. A literary journal. A conference mention. A fellowship shortlist. Each discovery raised more questions than answers. Claire had not merely studied literature. She had excelled. The pattern became impossible to ignore. This was not someone who casually enjoyed books. This was someone who had once been building a serious academic future. Yet the trail ended abruptly. 5 years ago, the record stopped. No graduate program. No publications. No faculty position. Nothing. It was as though she had simply stepped away from the path she was clearly meant to follow. Ethan leaned back in silence. Outside his office window, clouds drifted across the skyline. Inside, a strange feeling settled over him. Not satisfaction. Not triumph. Respect. The kind of respect that appears when assumptions collapse under the weight of reality. Somewhere between scholarship applications and conference records, Claire Bennett's story had changed direction. And for reasons he could not yet understand, that unfinished chapter seemed far more important than everything that came before it. The more Ethan Whitmore searched, the stranger the story became. Late that evening, long after most employees had left the office, the glow from his computer screen illuminated a conference room that overlooked the city. Manhattan stretched beyond the glass like a field of stars. Yet Ethan barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the scattered pieces of Claire Bennett's past. Additional records surfaced as he dug deeper. Scholarship announcements, academic awards, faculty recommendations filled with unusually strong praise. One professor described her as one of the most gifted students he had taught in 20 years. Another predicted a future in higher education. Ethan sat back and rubbed his forehead. None of it matched the image most people saw when they looked at Claire. Then he found something else. A university alumni publication from 6 years earlier. The article was brief, easy to overlook. It mentioned that Claire had postponed graduate school shortly before enrollment. No explanation was given, just a simple note that she had withdrawn from the program. Ethan opened another archived page, then another. Eventually a pattern emerged. Around the same period, every academic reference disappeared. No conferences, no fellowships, no publications, nothing. It was as though someone had stepped off a train moments before reaching the destination. Ethan stared out the window. People rarely abandoned dreams without a reason, especially not dreams they had worked so hard to build. The following afternoon, Claire arrived at the restaurant for another shift. The city buzzed with its usual energy. Taxis filled the streets. Construction crews worked on nearby sidewalks. Office workers hurried through crowded intersections carrying coffee cups and deadlines. Claire moved through it all quietly. Her routine never changed. She arrived 15 minutes early, checked the reservation list, prepared her station, smiled at coworkers, the same as always. Yet beneath that routine lived responsibilities nobody at the restaurant fully understood. After clocking in, she stepped outside for a brief break and checked her phone. A message waited. It came from a home healthcare coordinator. The appointment has been confirmed for Friday morning. Claire read the message twice before placing the phone back into her bag. Her expression softened. Not sadness, not frustration, something closer to determination. When she returned inside, Rebecca noticed immediately. Everything okay? Claire nodded. Just family matters. Rebecca smiled sympathetically. You always say that. Claire laughed softly. That is because it is usually true. The conversation ended there. Across town, Ethan sat through a board meeting while staring at numbers projected onto a screen. Revenue forecasts, expansion plans, investor expectations. Normally, he would have dominated the discussion. Today his thoughts drifted elsewhere. Family matters. He did not know those exact words had been spoken, yet somehow they were already leading him toward the truth. Because every clue pointed in the same direction. Claire Bennett had not failed. She had not been pushed aside. She had not lacked talent. Something else had happened. Something important enough to make a brilliant young scholar walk away from a future she had clearly earned. And as the pieces slowly came together, Ethan began to suspect that the most remarkable part of Claire's story was not what she had achieved. It was what she had quietly chosen to give up. Friday morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky. The city moved with its usual urgency, but Claire Bennett's day began far from Manhattan's towers and conference rooms. A small brick building stood in a quiet neighborhood nearly 40 minutes from the restaurant. The sign outside identified it as a long-term rehabilitation and assisted care center. Claire walked through the front entrance carrying a paper bag and her familiar canvas tote. The receptionist smiled immediately. Good morning, Claire. Good morning, Diane. She has been asking about you since breakfast. Claire laughed softly. That sounds about right. A few minutes later, she entered a sunlit room overlooking a small garden. An elderly woman sat near the window wrapped in a light blue sweater. Her silver hair caught the morning light. Several books rested neatly on the table beside her chair. The woman's face brightened instantly. There you are. Claire smiled. I promised I would come. You were 10 minutes late. 9. I counted. Claire laughed and set the paper bag on the table. Inside were fresh blueberry muffins from a bakery 2 blocks away. Her mother's favorite. The older woman's name was Margaret Bennett. Years earlier, she had taught literature at a public high school. For decades, she had spent her days introducing students to novels, poetry, and plays. Now health challenges had slowly narrowed her world to a single room, a garden view, and weekly visits from the daughter who never missed an appointment. Claire poured tea while her mother talked about a book she had recently finished. Their conversation flowed naturally from one author to another. Shakespeare became Austen. Austen became Steinbeck. Steinbeck became poetry. The same rhythm they had shared for years. At one point, Margaret studied her daughter carefully. You look tired. Claire shrugged. Busy week. Too many shifts. Claire smiled. Probably. Margaret lowered her teacup. You know, when you were 22, I was convinced I would spend the rest of my life attending your lectures. Claire looked down at the table. The comment carried no criticism, only affection, yet it still landed heavily. Life changed. Yes. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed her hand. Because of me. Claire immediately shook her head. Because of circumstances. Claire. Mom. They shared a familiar smile. The conversation had happened many times before. Neither would ever fully convince the other. Later that afternoon, as Claire prepared to leave, Margaret glanced toward the canvas tote resting beside the chair. Still carrying that notebook? Claire laughed. Every day. Good. Why? Margaret smiled gently. Because some people stop becoming themselves when life gets difficult. She nodded toward the bag. You never did. The words followed Claire all the way back to Manhattan. Across the city, Ethan Whitmore sat in his office reviewing information Lauren had gathered from publicly available records. The picture was finally becoming clearer. Medical assistance forms, caregiver references, employment history that aligned perfectly with the years Claire disappeared from academic circles. No scandal, no failure, no collapse, just responsibility. Ethan leaned back in silence. For several moments, he stared at nothing. Then a realization settled over him with unexpected force. Claire Bennett had not walked away from her future because she lacked ability. She had walked away because someone she loved needed her more. And suddenly, every conversation, every answer, every quiet smile made perfect sense. The following week, Ethan Whitmore returned to the restaurant alone. No investors, no board members, no audience, just a man carrying questions he could no longer ignore. The evening crowd had not yet arrived. Soft jazz drifted through the dining room. Outside, the last light of day faded between the buildings. Claire Bennett was arranging menus near the entrance when she noticed him. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. Good evening, Ethan. Good evening, Claire. For a moment, neither moved. Then Claire guided him to a quiet table near the window. Meeting someone? She asked. Actually, yes. She glanced around the nearly empty dining room. I do not see anyone. Ethan smiled faintly. That is because I came to meet you. Claire paused. Not alarmed. Not uncomfortable. Simply cautious. I am working. I know. He sat down. And I am not asking for anything inappropriate. Claire waited. Ethan looked out toward the city lights gathering beyond the glass. I spent most of my life believing success was easy to recognize. Claire folded her hands lightly in front of her apron. Most people do. I thought accomplishments announce themselves. Sometimes they do. And sometimes they wear a waitress uniform. Claire said nothing. Ethan continued. I know about the scholarship. Her expression remained calm. I know about the graduate program. Silence. I know about your mother. This time her eyes lowered briefly. Not from embarrassment. From emotion. Ethan immediately regretted mentioning it so directly. I am sorry, he said. That was not my story to investigate. Claire looked toward the window. For several seconds, she seemed to be deciding whether to leave the conversation behind or continue it. Finally, she spoke. Most people hear that story and tell me I sacrificed too much. And what do you think? Claire smiled softly. I think people assume every valuable thing can be measured by a title, a salary, or a degree. Ethan leaned back. Can it not? Can love? The question settled gently between them. Ethan had no immediate answer. Claire continued. My mother spent 30 years teaching other people's children how to read, think, and dream. When she needed help, I did what family does. Her voice remained steady. I never saw that as a sacrifice. Ethan stared at the table. Every boardroom lesson he had learned suddenly felt incomplete. You gave up an extraordinary future. Claire shook her head. No, her smile returned. Quiet. Certain. I lived one. The simplicity of the answer struck harder than any speech. Ethan looked at her and realized something he had missed for years. Success was not always found in the people who reached the highest positions. Sometimes it lived inside those who quietly honored their responsibilities when nobody was watching. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan Whitmore felt humbled. Not by wealth, not by power, not by intelligence alone, by character. And as Claire returned to work, carrying menus toward a newly arrived family near the entrance, Ethan understood that the most impressive thing about her had never been Shakespeare. It was the life she had chosen when nobody would have blamed her for choosing differently. Months passed. Spring arrived in Manhattan. The gray skies of winter gave way to clear mornings and longer evenings. Life moved forward the way it always does. Quietly, one decision at a time. Claire Bennett continued working at the restaurant. She still carried the same notebook. She still arrived early. She still treated every guest with the same calm attention. From the outside, very little had changed. Yet beneath the surface, something important had. Through a partnership with the educational foundation Ethan Whitmore supported, Claire had agreed to help develop a mentorship program for students whose academic journeys had been interrupted by family responsibilities. She refused publicity. She declined interviews. She asked for no special recognition. She simply wanted the students to receive the support she once wished had existed. The program grew quickly. Not because of marketing, because people responded to sincerity. One afternoon, Ethan attended a small scholarship ceremony hosted by the foundation. There were no television cameras, no reporters, just students, families, and teachers gathered in a modest auditorium. Claire stood near the back of the room speaking with a nervous young woman who had recently been accepted into graduate school. Ethan watched as the student's face slowly brightened with confidence. It was a familiar sight. Claire had a gift for making people believe in themselves. Not through grand speeches, through genuine attention. Later, after the event ended, Ethan found her standing alone outside beneath the warm glow of the setting sun. The city hummed softly around them. "You know," he said, "when I first met you, I thought I understood success." Claire smiled. "And now?" Ethan looked toward the students leaving the building with their families. "Now I think I only understood achievement." Claire laughed quietly. "There is a difference. A very large one." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan added, "You changed the way I see people." Claire shook her head gently. "No, you changed the way you see people." Ethan considered that, then nodded. She was right. As always. Across the street, traffic lights shifted from red to green. Pedestrians crossed the avenue. Somewhere nearby, a musician played a soft melody on a saxophone. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary moments. Yet somehow they felt important. Claire opened her notebook and glanced at a page she had marked years earlier. Then she closed it and slipped it back into her bag. "What was the quote?" Ethan asked. "The one you were looking at." Claire smiled toward the horizon. "It said that the true measure of a life is not what we keep, but what we give." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he watched as she walked toward the subway entrance, disappearing into the evening crowd just as she had the night they first met. Only this time, he understood what he was seeing. Not a waitress, not a scholar, not a sacrifice. A woman who had quietly chosen dignity, responsibility, and kindness when no one was watching. And perhaps that was the rarest achievement of all. Because some people spend their lives trying to be extraordinary. Others simply choose to be good. If this story stayed with you, perhaps it is because all of us have met someone whose value was hidden beneath the surface. Someone the world almost overlooked. Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoy stories that remind us to look a little deeper, stay with us for the next one.